Hey people, today my guest is Richard Falk. He's a world-renowned scientist and researcher. He's emeritus on Princeton beam, and I'm so thrilled to have him as a guest today. He's an expert on many different topics regarding human rights, the development of those legal systems, and geopolitical events. It's a very broad topic that we're going to try to cover today, and I think it will be interesting for everyone to listen. Dr. Falk, it's an honor to have you here. Please, if you could give the viewers a little summary of your work, of what exactly you do and how you got into that field, it would be a nice start for us.
I'll try. It's a long story because I'm quite old and have been working in these issues for more or less 70 years. I started as a law student who didn't want to be a lawyer. My father was a lawyer in New York City, and I knew that, but I didn't know quite what to do with those interests. So I began to disqualify myself from a practical career. I studied at Yale Law School a lot of things that most law students avoid, like the law of India, for instance. I devoted a lot of attention and was given a Fulbright to study further in India for a year after I graduated. But at the last minute, the U.S. State Department canceled the Fulbright program because it wanted to punish India for not paying for some wheat that it had received on a loan basis. So I found myself without any employment, and somebody got sick at a Midwestern university, and they were so desperate they hired me as a visiting one-year professor. I had never thought of an academic career, partly because my early student life, I didn't distinguish myself. I was more into sports than studies.
Really?
But once I arrived at this big campus of Ohio State University, I realized that this was, for me, a very privileged life. I could do what I wanted at a very young age, and I enjoyed teaching and the freedom to determine my own structure of work and activities by and large. And so that was the professional beginning of my life. And then I was very fortunate that Princeton had an opening for a chair in international law that had a very peculiar requirement that you had to be trained in law but not too interested in it. And they felt I was qualified on both counts. And so I got this opportunity and stayed there for 40 years. And because it had no law school, I taught law and politics and became more broadly interested in the political and geopolitical context of legal development, and worried by the what I felt to be the irresponsible statecraft of parts of the Cold War. And I was particularly worried by the way nuclear weapons were being integrated into the political consciousness of Western political leaders.
Around what year are we talking about? When was this?
Probably in the late 60s, 70s. But the decisive political turn came in toward the end of the 1960s, I'd grown up in a fairly conservative, anti-communist political atmosphere. My father was a lawyer for some of the leading anti-communist figures, including the exiled Prime Minister of Russia in the interim period between Tsarism and Bolshevism. And so I reacted somewhat to that experience, but with a certain sense of confusion. But what I opposed the Vietnam War initially on legal grounds, that it was an unlawful use of force. But then I went to North Vietnam twice during the war and was very impressed by the leadership there, by the nature of the victimization of a national people fighting for their independence and sort of anti-colonial continuation of the war against the French. And it really had an effect on my political identity and on the issues that engaged me for some time. Another strand of thought, now maybe stop me if I'm talking in too much.
No, don't worry. It's interesting. It's interesting to hear about it. I've got 2 whole pages of questions. Don't worry.
But another strand came from my experience as a graduate student at Harvard, where I ended up getting a Doctor of Law degree. But I learned more from my fellow students than from the faculty while I was there. And I developed an interest in what we then called world order studies, how what now is more generally talked of in the context of global governance. How do we achieve a more peaceful, more just way of relating to international relations, and became part of a global project called World Order Models Project, which started in the end of the 60s and lasted till 1990, and there's recently been kind of effort to revive it. It brought to bear 2 central themes, which was first, how do you act to avoid war between the major political actors in the world, avoiding World War III, essentially. And secondly, how does the transition from colonialism to a real political independence and economic development take place? And we had very good participants from all parts of the world, including China and the Soviet Union and Latin America, Africa, India. And the project was funded by people who believed in world government, which actually the participants in the project, including myself, didn't believe it. It was,
I can ask, I'm a bit curious there. If I think about back then, you had the bipolar world, you had the Eastern Bloc, you had the West, you had, of course, the little third, not that small, but like third neutral countries under India and Egypt and Yugoslavia back then. How would you say, because many young people don't even realize anymore how close people felt back then to like a third world war. At any moment, the red button could be pressed for like nuclear annihilation. So if you compare that time back then to the times now, let's say 1 or 2 years ago, because with the Ukraine conflict, it's got a bit more sensitive suddenly. But like, do you think we made good progress towards the goal of peace and like, how would you say it? World government? Is the world government a project? Is that a good thing? Do you think the development that we had was a good one? What would you say about these kind of topics?
Well, again, that's a complicated, multifaceted topic. I think there was more of a sense early in the Cold War of remembering the devastation of World War II. See, and even younger people learn from their families and from their background that it was very important to avoid that. But there was also this sort of ideological war going on to make one feel that even war was worthwhile to avoid succumbing to communism. So there was the famous slogan, better dead than red, and the counter slogan, better red than dead, representing these sort of two tendencies in the North. And that was, that reached one sort of climax in Europe around the various Berlin crises and fear that the understandings reached during World War II between the victors, including the division of Europe and the division of Germany and the division of Berlin, and that those what I call geopolitical fault lines were being put under dangerous pressure. But in retrospect, and in light of the present issues, it was very enlightening to have established those fault lines, because they had unfortunate consequences for the people that were subjected to in the various nations, but they created a kind of consensus as to where these governments should not exert too much pressure, especially territorial pressure or intervention. And the West put up with these interventions in Eastern Europe in 1956 in Hungary and East Germany and Poland elsewhere, and then Czech, the Prague Spring. And you have to, it's not often said, but the Soviet Union put up with a lot of CIA activity in the Western European countries, including covert efforts to destroy the communist parties in these various countries that were very strong at the end of World War II for a variety of reasons.
It's a very interesting take. It's really an interesting take. Like, in difference to today, where it's like a bit muddy, it's like foggy. We don't know exactly where the lines are, which players, because nowadays we also have like these big players, these superpowers. I think most people would say China, Russia, America, of course, are like these big players, but we don't know nowadays that clearly where is the sphere of influence, which country is on which side, which player is on which team. And back then it was in some way easier, as you say. That's a very interesting take. I think that's so.
No, it's more than easier. It was really a form of peacekeeping to create these clear these somewhat. They're not crystal clear because they're not on maps and they're not. But there was a general understanding at Yalta, Potsdam, these conferences of the winners of World War II. And so the present situation is more closer to what led to World War I. The absence of clear boundaries between, and then you can easily stumble into an unintended and yet very destructive war. So that I think we're living in a very dangerous time because of that issue. And unlike World War I, there are these weapons of mass destruction in the background of the conflict.
Well, it's an interesting thing, if I may ask. It's like, now that you say it, I never thought about it in this way, but it's like, let's take the Ukraine conflict, for example. Like, during the Cold War era, you knew perfectly well, if soldiers step over this line, this is going to be all the countries that fight against you. It was automatic. In the Ukraine conflict, like, it was not so clear for Russia, most likely, how strong would the reaction be, who would be on which side, how devastating would be the military reaction, the economic reaction, everything. So it was a bit blurry. And do you think that could, or do you understand you correctly, that could mean someone does something, a player does something, expects just a small reaction, but it could escalate into a much stronger reaction than they had anticipated. And if they had known what kind of reaction they would get, they would never have done it. So it was a better deterrent, a better peacekeeping method to have these clear lines and these clear consequences. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, well, I think of it, if one looks at it in a sophisticated way, they both have disadvantages.
Yeah, of course.
In other words, if the West had accepted the idea that Ukraine fit within the traditional sphere of influence of Russia, it would have avoided this geopolitical confrontation, but it would have subjected Ukraine to a lot of suffering.
Yeah.
Now, it turns out, though, with the geopolitical response added to the Russian aggression, that you also have perhaps more suffering for the Ukrainian people. That they would have been badly hurt if there was no concerted NATO response. On the other hand, they're worse hurt by the NATO response.
Yeah.
And it's also dangerous. And one of the dimensions of this that I give some emphasis to is that the West, and particularly the U.S., missed an opportunity after the implosion of the Soviet Union to create a more durable and less militarized form of geopolitics, with more cooperation for solving common global challenges like climate change, etc.
Yeah.
It saw the situation as one of creating an opportunity to establish what I call, and others have called, a unipolar global security arrangement. So only see the implication of unipolarity is that only the U.S. has spheres of influence.
Yeah.
And any other country, even on its own border, it has no geopolitical or legal entitlement to intervene to protect its security interests. It's this collision between these two visions, where the Chinese and the Russians are trying to establish a multipolar global security system, and the NATO West is trying to extend this post-Cold War unipolarity. Mm. And so the strategic stakes are very high, and the people of Ukraine are paying the large part of the price.
Wow.
For that. And that's and the media has been, at least the media that I'm familiar with, you may be familiar with more about, the media doesn't give any, it's as if they're completely unaware of this trade-off between the narrow view of what happened and the more geopolitical or contextual view.
I just recently had an interview with another researcher from completely different, Joel Best, about how narratives form and how data is used. We discussed a bit about how media just, they need to push narratives, they need to make money, they need that clickbait title. They're not really that interested in a thoroughly investigated, proper presentation of objective facts and like a multi viewpoint of different issues to like say, okay, this is from this side, this is from this side, how can we work it out, what are the different takes? It's like no, it has to be a clickbait title, it has to make people click, to make them view it, to make them watch it. And also we all know, after all, let's not pretend that it's not like that. Media pushes a narrative. That's always been like that. It's 100 years of history where we can see media, news, and everything pushes something. That's just the way it is.
Well, see, I agree with that line of analysis, but I would add two factors. One is that after the defeat of the U.S. in the Vietnam War, there was a conscious decision that part of the reason for the defeat was the failure to exert sufficient influence over the media. Yeah. So the media, if you look at the pre-Vietnam and Vietnam coverage and the post-Vietnam coverage, you will see, at least in the U.S. context and to some extent the European, I think, context, you will see that the media has become in this foreign policy domain more of an instrument of state propaganda. So when the U.S. wanted to go to war against Iraq 20 years ago, if you look back at the media, it was championing the war. Same thing with Ukraine.
And not just that. If for the people who might be too young or who haven't been that conscious back then, simply the way the military included the media into the action, how they make sure to have their media people with them, to make sure the narrative is pushed the right way, to have like the best shots, where to put them, where to make them stand, into which platoon to put the reporters and everything, was a vastly different method and take than it was during Vietnam. So one has also
that was part of that was part of what they learned. That was part of the learning from Vietnam. See, they deliberately did that. They felt they didn't, so they tried to co-opt a portion of the media and important journalists, and as you say, put them into the combat situation, make them identify almost as soldiers on the one side. And then the other thing they did was to make the armed forces a profession rather than to force people as part of their citizenship to be drafted, or what was called. And so the middle classes were depoliticized when it came to war peace issues. And this was all part of the effort to learn from the political mistakes of the Vietnam experience. And it had a profound effect, especially with the rise of these autocratic leaders in so many countries, including U.S., and a kind of post-truth atmosphere where truth is not the objective anymore, but instilling beliefs. You want people to believe certain things, as you were saying about narrative. You want a certain kind of narrative to be believed, and you're not concerned, you're not influenced by whether it's true or not, or objective or not. You have the commitment to its priority.
We talked about this recently. It's like, as you say, to believe something, and we discovered a bit, another researcher was more like, it's an emotional hook. The importance is to make you feel what they want you to feel, and then they give you something that we say, and now we're going to connect that feeling with this happening, with this topic, with whatever, so that you don't want to learn the facts or things about this topic, but that anytime this topic is brought up, you just relive, you re-experience that emotion you had. And that's how the narrative is pushed. That's a really interesting take. Interesting that we get into that topic again, because the interview was just recently. And we're now at the, interesting how we go through the times. We're now at the Vietnam War era. Now we got a bit further. 9/11 times, Desert Storm, Desert Storm, Bush Jr., so to speak. Those had huge implications for the American system. Let's be honest, it was somewhat of a game changer if you consider like the Homeland Security Act and everything. So would you give us a bit of your opinion, your research, your view on what changed pre and after? What is the difference for the American people, or maybe the whole world, between before and after?
You mean 9/11, the 9/11 attack?
I would say, I would like to, yes, of course, it's 9/11, but I would like to say not the terrorism itself, but like more the legal ramifications that came afterwards. Those would be more interesting to me.
Yes. See, I think one of the important political personalities at that time was Donald Rumsfeld, who was the Secretary of Defense, and he made a very telling a statement on the first anniversary of 9/11. He said he called it a blessing in disguise. And what he meant by that was that it gave the government an excuse to mobilize American society for war and to mobilize the West to some extent for war, and to justify interventions that were rather remotely connected, if at all, to the threats that were posed by the 9/11 attacks. And the Iraq War was a prime example of that, where they used the atmosphere of the 9/11 attacks. And the same thing to some degree in Afghanistan, where they always wanted to reverse the Taliban control, and this gave them the excuse as a counter-terrorist haven to engage in this wider strategic, and then to get into the failed state building operations that went on for 20 years and ended after trillions of dollars were expended in a complete failure, complete absence of results. So it's part of this over-reliance on an over-investment in military solutions to political problems. And again, the Vietnam War is very helpful because it was a war in which the U.S. had complete military dominance, yet lost the war. But it didn't question the military budget or the a military approach to conflict. It did these other things that made it more possible to fail, but to fail in different ways. And the Iraq and all these other interventions were all failures, and a very expensive failure. Expensive because they diverted resources from what could have been done to improve the lives of poorer people, including in the U.S. And
infrastructure lives, and also the price that was paid through journalists' lives, blood, tears, was for very little, if anything, gained at all. To think of it, it's like really.
Say things were lost. I mean, Iraq was a much more stable society than it became after the intervention and the failed state-building enterprise. And it's closer to Iran. See, the part of the original justification was containment of Iran. It now is really dominated by Iranian political allegiance.
I would like to ask you there about something that's very interesting, because you researched and you worked and you read and you did a lot of stuff in that realm of United Nations, international law, geopolitics. To someone who's not that well versed, let me ask you and explain to me exactly and it's going to be another question that's very multifaceted, I know, but like, what does the UN do in these regards? Like it seems very often to be an institution that can be just kind of ignored, to be honest. Like in the Ukraine Russia conflict now, back in the Afghanistan conflict, back in the Iraq conflict, back in the it seems like these international law situations don't really matter, or do they matter or not? Like as a normal citizen, it's hard to understand what of all of that is even relevant, and where do countries just say we do what we want anyway?
I think that's a really important and very fair kind of concern. I think the first attempt to understand that deficiency of what I would call deficiency of global governance is that the UN was designed to be weak. Mm-hmm. And in that sense, it's not, it should not be blamed as an organization, because that's the way it was set up. They wouldn't have given the veto to the most dangerous countries in the world if they had really wanted to be an effective respecter of international law and the UN Charter. They wanted to give the winners of World War II discretion to use force when they wanted.
Mm.
But the West in particular plays a double game. They use force when they want to, but when their rivals use force, they suddenly become very international law oriented and invoke the charter and are self-righteous about, the American Secretary of State talks about a rules-governed world without any implication that those rules have any application to the American behavior. And that idea of a weak UN was partly prompted by the fact that the League of Nations set up after World War I collapsed because it didn't give the powerful countries this discretion. And they didn't participate. The US never joined. The Soviet Union was expelled. Germany withdrew. So it failed in a different, sort of the opposite way. Mm. So it's a dilemma. Are you better off with geopolitical actors within the UN framework with the veto, or excluding them, and then what you have is you don't have a genuine international organization. You have a ideologically dominated political instrument or policy instrument. And so there is no easy answer to that other than the assessment by these geopolitical actors, and as you say, US, Russia, and China at this time, coming to the sensible conclusion that they're better off cooperating than engaging in this traditional kind of big power conflict. Yep. And they're better off dealing with climate change than with these problems of interstate friction and ideology. But how you get that understanding when there's a big vested interest, corporate interest in arms sales, in a big military budget, and you don't have any countervailing power. There's nothing to be gained by those that would like to cut the military budget.
And it's also a bit of an issue. It's like I've recently read it in game theory research, like the Machiavellianism in these ideas is like, if you get a few players together that all accept, okay, we will cut our budget for military supplies, for example, or we will get rid of all weapons, whatever. The issue is, if one player cheats, that player is going to dominate all the others. So no player is willing to risk that and says, no, we gotta stay on our budget with our weapons and so on, because one cheater could ruin the game for everyone. So the only way we have is by all of us playing the game all along. It's a very problematic situation in that kind where I don't think anyone has a proper solution just now. But I'm curious to ask you something where it's really, there's no right or wrong answer. It's just I'm just curious about your personal opinion. It's like, in the last few years, we've had a lot of conspiracy theories, topics about, a new world order, one world government, and so on. And I recently had listened to a podcast from Patrick Bet-David, like he's some famous guy with a lot of money. And he talked about the dangers of a one government system. It's like if you don't like how Russia is right now, you can go to the US. If you don't like what it's like in the US, you can go to Europe. If you don't like the rules in Europe, you can go to China. And if you don't like the rules in China, you can go to India. So it's like there is the benefit of different systems with different rules and different, let's call it experiments in how to live in a society. You can go to the Middle East and live basically almost under Sharia law, or you can go into the West and live under more progressive laws where LGBTQ is more respected, and so on and so on, just as an easy example. On the other side, it gives you the chance to get away from, if one of these systems becomes autocratic or begins to infringe on you in ways that you don't accept, that you don't like. If you have a one world government style, like doesn't matter if it's one government or if it's an international organization, you have the benefit that the world would be more peaceful, we could be more efficient towards goals like climate change, like, as we said, get rid of all the weapons, take care of world poverty, food, hunger, and so on. But you risk that if that system becomes bad for people, they have no place to go to. They can't escape it. What would be your personal opinion on this duality of benefit and cost and risk of the two different systems?
Well, I think that the dilemma is real. I mean, I think there is a cost of excessive unification, political unification. On the other hand, it may be exaggerated, at least in the short run, because most ideas about a unified world government or are based on a strong federalist principle in which you would keep the diversity, and that the parts of the system, the various units, subunits in the system, would have sufficient autonomy that you could still move around and escape things you didn't like. It is true that the central government, as has happened with a federal system like India's or Brazil or US, becomes concentrated at the center and very autocratic and imposes its will on the part. And so it's the balancing of the whole and the part that is the challenge if you move toward greater political unification. But I think there's, especially one of the elements that you didn't mention, which I think is relevant, is that we're living in a post-colonial era where countries are very attached to their political independence. And therefore, they're resistant. They think of any kind of political unification as a way of subjecting them to some new form of hegemonic domination. And that's part of the objection to this unipolar kind of development that the West has been making in the aftermath of the Cold War. So it's these issues all have bright sides and dark sides and are difficult to balance and assess.
Yeah, I might have overlooked that, because you're absolutely right. It's an important fact. I think I might have overlooked it because basically I'm a European, so especially a Western European, for us it's like pretty normal to have the West as the hegemony, the American influence, to be like America is the one who decides cultural, political, everything. And for us was the unification of the EU and Europe was basically a very positive thing in most regards. Of course, people are very displeased about many aspects of the details and so on, but overall, even if people speak against it, on another level, it was a very positive experience, I personally would say, for most of the people. So they don't have that emotional reaction like countries that were legit colonized, because it's like a completely different game. And so for us, that aspect of giving sovereignty to international organizations has, of course, a completely different connotations than for these other countries. So that's thank you very much for making me more conscious about that. Something that I overlooked a bit in
that. Part of that feeling is that the colonial period was one where the national experiences of the colonies was basically suppressed and distorted and co-opted to some degree, whereas in Europe, the various national communities were never really threatened in that way. They were not occupied. They were not. I mean, there were brief exceptions, but fundamentally, they had a very strong national character, which the EU hasn't eroded. I mean, when you're in Italy, you still feel Italian. You still feel the strength of Italian cuisine, language, culture, and same with France or UK. You're in Vienna, is that right?
Yeah, Austria. Yep. And it's like,
Yeah.
as you say, people still identify on the national level. Like, you don't identify as I'm a European. It's like,
Yeah.
and you're not an EU citizen. It's like very different from, for example, with the USA, where it's like, okay, first you're American, and then you're a New Yorker, or you're from Texas, or you're like West Coast, East Coast. But here it's like, no, no, no. I'm German, or I'm Austrian, or I'm French, or I'm Italian. As you say, it's a completely different thing. And like on the second level, you're, oh, but I'm a European too, of course. So it's very different identification. It's really interesting take.
But in some parts of America, if you travel in the South,
Yeah.
in the part of the Civil War, the states that lost the Civil War, they might give you the other answer. Texans might first say, I'm a Texan before I'm an American.
Interesting.
And I'm from Georgia, not from America,
Really interesting. Really, I mean, I gotta admit, it's also it's a bit confusing for many Europeans with the stuff in America, especially with like the social issues. I gotta admit, like the racial tensions in America, as you say, the Civil War stuff, still with the northern and southern states and so on. It's like for Europeans, it's like, man, that's water under the bridge. We've had a dozen wars since that. Like the racial tensions in the USA from stuff that's been 100 or 200 years ago, when in Europe we've had in the last 100 years 2 world wars, and like Germany and France were attacking each other. The Eastern Bloc was having really nasty wars. We've had like death camps and stuff. And when you look here, 20 years later, politically, okay, we're gonna work again with each other. Forget it. Everything, not like forget it. I'm hyperbolic speech, but like, okay, it's water under the bridge. Let's work the next. Oh, we want to be a EU. Yeah, okay. Racism on a completely different level and everything. So it's like very confusing for many Europeans why the Americans hold on to the stuff for so long, like for centuries. Why?
Well, it's opportunistically revived by politicians, and the people like Trump have done a good job of remobilizing this white supremacy attitude. You know, I first came to Vienna in 1954 when Vienna was a divided city, and it was quite interesting the way it was divided. You had to be careful where you crossed the lines, but it's an impressive place.
Yeah, interesting. I hope you like to stay. Like that's very, very interesting take where many Europeans hold a bit back on commentary because we don't really understand it. Many don't really understand what's going on with America and some of the sentiments because it's like so old. It's so much other stuff has happened. I think maybe that's because we have more issues, more wars going on. Like America hasn't had a war on its own soil since the Civil War. And I think it's hugely different when you really, as you said it before, war changes people and their perception even for the next generations. How the parents talk about it, how stuff is talked about. Here in Europe, everybody can go to their grandparents and get a story of how cities were bombed, how they had to rebuild everything, and so on. And like Americans don't really have that. So of course their perception and their big myth is a different one. Like as you said, the Civil War is a big one because it was the last time that people experienced these kind of hardships on their own soil. And it's carried on with the flags and the stories and so on. So that's really, really interesting. I've got to ask you how much time you've got. I don't want to overextend you.
I could spend 15 minutes more if you wish.
Dr. Falk, I would like your personal opinion on another topic that is very intertwined with all of this, the view of academia and the role of academia in the kind of issues that we discussed right now, in forming consciousness, forming narratives, getting the data, getting knowledge for people, analyzing how it happened. What is, in your opinion, the role of academia going forward? Should it just be viewing objectively? Should it be reflecting? Should it be actively trying to come up with solutions? What do you think for all the younger students and all the younger researchers now? What is their role in this big game?
Well, it's again a very difficult issue, partly because it also reflects society relations. In other words, I'm here in Turkey, where the state feels very threatened by an independent academic community and by criticism that emanate from professors and others. So it's almost like a encounter between and from that kind of perspective, the role of education is to train people to be helpful to the economic development and social development and providing the necessary skills for a modern society. The more liberal tradition of academic life is anchored in notions of academic freedom and the importance of training young people to be engaged citizens as well as skillful professionals. And I guess I'm an example of that latter style of academic life, where I think that young people that have the greatest stake in the future, and particularly in a future that is threatened now by the way older people are running the world, it's extremely important that younger people are encouraged to think for themselves, to think critically, to feel that they have a legitimate stake in forming the policies of their society. In other words, engage citizenship oriented toward saving the earth as well as traditional notions of patriotism and national sovereignty. And these issues are being fought over in the U.S. now. I mean, where on the one side you have the right wing trying to ban books of really world-class literature. And yes, in Florida, the Governor DeSantis, who's the Republican alternative to Trump, is an advocate of rigid control over the curriculum. He doesn't want the history of slavery to be taught to contemporary American students, and doesn't want faculty that are inclined in liberal traditions. So for state universities in Florida, there's been a kind of denial of academic freedom and a mobilization of parents to put pressure on their particular high school or college to limit what their children. It's also a matter of sexual. One of the hot issues is
the topics of sexualization for children is pretty hot in America right now, as far as I can tell from Europe. I'm not sure what is true. I'm not in America, but it's like a hot topic over there right now.
Yeah, it's a hot topic on both sides.
It proves in Europe, at least, like it's easier to show a blown away skull than some breasts on TV. It's like weird for a European, but it's like this time you guys really seem to have a bit of a political fight about stuff going. I'm not sure if you want to comment on that or not, because I'm not too well versed. I couldn't like give my opinion or my feedback on it, but if you want to elaborate on that, feel free, please.
Well, it's again, it manifests the diversity of American society, where you have these conservative state governments, you know, like Indiana or Michigan, Illinois, passing laws banning trans, restricting the life and identity of trans people. And on the other hand, you have popular support for people choosing the sexual identity that they want, and many younger people coming out of their cities, particularly, now use these pronouns, you know, after their name to identify their sexual preferences. They will say she, them, or she, her.
It's starting a bit here too.
Yes, I'm sure. But
we're always a few years after you guys.
Yeah, it's all part of this sense of struggling between tradition and freedom, really, or tradition and permissiveness. And it has its ugly sides where, you know, people are brutalized in various ways. So it's not a pleasant thing, and for the people involved, it's probably very difficult. But more and more very young people, friends of our children, are saying that they feel they're not born the way that their identity is not what they look like. So boys feel that they want to be girls, and girls feel they want to be boys.
Okay.
And how parents cope with that.
Gone through these books or what? And the governors want to stop that stuff, or what?
Yes.
That the way it is, like. Okay.
Yes, and have this childhood surgery, you know.
Okay.
All those issues are very much alive at the present time.
Topic gonna be a dangerous topic to talk about, but I think I'll go look and see if I can get one or two guests who can elaborate on those topics. As I said, I'm not really well versed in them. My personal field is from mechatronics and business, so stuff like economy, geopolitics, technical stuff, in those I'm very well versed. Medicine, I'm going to start now. We're gonna have a nice little interview in 1 or 2 weeks with a gonna be a secret for the viewers. You will get the link down below on the video. Dr. Falk, I could talk without an end with you, because as I think, just as we're talking now, it's an awesome segue into the topic of human rights, how they developed, how they're seen in different areas of the world. I think all of that, which is also a big part of your research, would be interesting to talk about, but I know we sadly don't have that much time. I could just keep on talking a few hours with you, but I want to thank you very, very much for the time you took, for the effort you put, for the honor of being a guest on my show. I want to thank you very, very much for that. And I wish you just the very, very best. I hope your family will be well off. And I want to thank you once more for being a guest on this show. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I enjoyed our interaction. It was more of a conversation than a monologue, and that's always good. And I think you're embarked on a good journey. It's a worthwhile journey.
Nice words. Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Falk. Thank you.